Our guest today wrote a book that I wish I had been aware of 4 years ago. It was during that time that my adult daughter and I went through a period of estrangement, a year and a half without any communication, and then 3 years without seeing each other. I can tell you from personal experience that it was very difficult to feel happy when I was carrying so much emotion around this. When people would ask me about my daughter, I felt ashamed to admit that I really didn't know how she was doing. So if you're someone who is going through or has gone through a similar experience, I want you to know that I get it. And I'm really glad you're here. Dr. Joshua Coleman offers actionable steps for us to take personal responsibility where appropriate, develop self-compassion, and stay open and loving to our adult child who has cut us off either temporarily or permanently.
Unfortunately, I got interested in this topic because my own daughter, when she was 22, cut off contact with me for several years. I was married and divorced in my 20s and divorced fairly shortly after my first wife and I had our daughter, and then had twins from my second and current marriage of 30 years. Which my daughter probably felt in some ways displaced by, and a number of other things that commonly happen with divorce. So at a certain point in her early 20s, she had cut off contact with me for several years, which was easily the most painful, disorienting, awful thing that I've ever had to go through. And I eventually was able to reconcile with her and kind of work my way back into her life. But there was really no advice out there. And the advice that I got at the time was really not helpful, in many ways counterproductive. It's the kind of advice that I hear many therapists continue to give other parents who are suffering from estrangement. So I just felt like I wanted to write a book that would provide people a way to reconnect with their child once their child had cut themselves off.
So one of the things that I read in your book had to do with just as a generation, over time, historically, things have changed for us as parents. And I'd be interested if you could kind of share briefly what we as baby boomers are most challenged by as parents.
Sure. Well, we're probably one of the first generations to invest as much in our children psychologically. We've had the financial means to do so. And one of the big preoccupations with parents in our generation, particularly parents in the middle and upper classes. Today, it's parents across all classes. But when we were raising our children, particularly parents in the middle and upper classes, were very concerned with raising children who were very self-possessed, who were very assertive, who knew what they wanted in life, were creative, independent, etc. So we became very interested in creating children who really knew who they were and knew what they wanted. And similarly, at the same time, there was the dawn of the internet. So parents were also raising children at a time when they were being overwhelmed with parenting advice, uh, preoccupied with doing the right thing, feeling very anxious. Um, Today's millennials are seeing therapists more than any other generation has before them. So at the same time, there was a huge shift in the culture in terms of what constitutes family. It used to be that family is forever. You should stay together for the sake of your children. Respect your elders, and all those ethoses that had kind of guided us for centuries were replaced by ethoses like, if you're not happy, you should get divorced. Respect is earned; it's not given. So the culture began to shift in a much more individualistic direction. So in many ways, estrangement is kind of the outgrowth of that. It's the outgrowth of children feeling like they have the right to set the terms of the relationship over the life course, and they've been given a very powerful means to do that and a language to do that too. My colleague, Stephanie Kuntz, as a historian, said that marriage has changed more in the past 30 years than it did in the prior 3,000. And the same thing can be said of parenting, that we're now really required to wear a bunch of hats that parents in my generation, certainly when my parents were raising me, they weren't expected to be so psychologically sophisticated, to be my playmate, to be my coach. I mean, just the number of hats that a parent was required to wear by the time we started raising children was really radically different. So that's why I take that position.
So, what, in your experience, are some reasons why adult children might cut off their parents?
Well, there's about 5 or 6 different reasons. The common prejudice is that, well, only parents who are really abusive get estranged. And certainly that's true. Sometimes there are certainly a percentage of children who cut off contact with the parents because the parents were neglectful or abusive or critical of their sexuality or just a mismatch in fundamental values. But there are a bunch of other reasons that people don't realize can occur as commonly. For example, if the adult child marries somebody that doesn't like the parents. I see this a lot, especially with the daughter-in-law who doesn't like the parents. From sociological research, we know that when sons get married, they're much more likely to be migrated into the household of the daughter-in-law rather than the other way around. And it's not uncommon for a kid who was close to the parents prior to marriage, if that son or daughter marries somebody who's more troubled or controlling, or dysfunctional, for that person to say, choose your parents or me, you can't have both, and the kid chooses their spouse. That's common mental illness, not only in the parent, but in the child. If the child has major depression or an anxiety disorder or a personality disorder, that may make kind of navigating the normal slings and arrows of family life much more difficult. Because we have invested much more in our children. Some adult children who've been raised feeling really close to their parents may know no other way to feel separate from the parent other than to cut them off. They feel too enmeshed, too close to the parent, too dependent on them. So the only way they know how to feel separate is to reject the parent. So those are some of the more common reasons that I would say. Well, and finally, really, divorce, I would say, is the most common, because there's about 4 different ways that divorce can increase the probability of estrangement. I'd say something like 3 out of 4 of the parents that I work with who are estranged, there's a divorce in their past. One is that after a divorce, it may cause one parent to poison the children against the other parent. The child may independently decide that one parent's more to blame than the other parent, even if that other parent isn't motivated for the child to have that perspective. And this can be true of when the children are young, or so-called gray divorces that happen when everybody's grown up. Divorce can bring in new people into the child's life that they have to compete with for financial, emotional resources. Finally, in a highly individualistic culture like ours, it can cause the adult child to see the parents as more as individuals with their own strengths and weaknesses, and less as a family unit that they're a part of. So divorce really drives up the risk of estrangement from my clinical experience.
So I'm sure in your practice, you see a lot of do's and don'ts, things that
Absolutely.
people should not do in response to having had their adult child stop contact with them, and then
Right.
recommendations. So could
Yeah.
you share a little bit of that?
Yes, some common mistakes are being oriented towards what's fair versus what's strategic. What's fair is that you would be able to demand contact, that your child would take into account all the wonderful things that you did for them, all the good memories you had together, how much you spent on their college education, all the ways that you were devoted. But once an estrangement has occurred, that's kind of off the table. So being oriented to what's fair is only going to make things worse. Related to that is trying to make your kid be in contact with you out of guilt or obligation. That ship has also sailed. The days when parents could use, the classic Jewish mother guilt trip is gone. Now, we're not supposed to make our kids feel guilty. So doing that.
I sure fell for it when I was a kid.
Yeah, when our generation, we could still follow, it was still an okay thing to do. That ship has sailed. That's no longer considered a reasonable demand. You're not supposed to make your kid feel guilty. And if you are, then maybe you're being a narcissist or borderline personality or that kind of thing. So trying to obligate your child through guilt is always going to backfire. A third, returning fire with fire. If your kid's angry at you, well, getting angry at them right back. That also doesn't work. You're much better off trying to find out what they're angry about, and speaking to the kernel of truth in their complaints. A fourth is sort of assuming that it's all about you. A lot of what our adult children do towards us, whether they're distant or unavailable or even critical, may have nothing to do with us. There's this kind of they're really in a different trajectory than we are. By the time we reach our age, we've sort of are kind of who we're going to be, but our children are still in development. So while our adult children are really at the forefront of our minds, we're not necessarily at the forefront of theirs. So their being unavailable or distant or not wanting to have as much time with us may have nothing to do with us per se. It may have more to do with just what their lives are like.
Mm.
And finally, a common mistake is not realizing how long it takes for reconciliation to occur once there's been an estrangement. From my perspective, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. Reconciling an estrangement can sometimes take years and years. So the more you have kind of a patient, loving, resilient kind of a perspective, assuming your goal is reconciliation, the better it's going to go. The more impatient, demanding, enough already perspective you have, the more it's going to backfire.
It's hard not to be impatient when years are going by.
Well, yeah, it's true. And I think that's what makes it so hard, particularly after we hit a certain age. We feel like, I don't have that many years left, and neither do you with me. So you kind of work through all this stuff already.
Yeah, right. Hey.
Yeah.
So what do you recommend on some of the best ways of handling it when an adult child has cut off their parents?
Well, the first and I think the most important is to find the kernel of truth in their complaints, that sometimes we have no idea and it doesn't make any sense to us. But typically in our adult children's complaints about us, there's at least a kernel of truth. So you want to start by speaking to the kernel of truth. Try not to be defensive, as hard as that is. Try not to prove them wrong. Try not to explain. Try not to justify. If your kid says you were too critical, too negative, too preoccupied, etc., try to understand why they feel the way that they do. If you don't understand what they're saying and they have a narrative of their childhood, you feel like they're rewriting their childhood and that it's a completely different narrative than they have had now that they're in therapy or now that they're married to this new person or whatever, try to understand that. If you can't understand it, say, I must have some blind spots that I don't recall it in just that way, but I understand that you're telling me this because it's something that you really want me to understand. Another important part of this principle is the way that a lot of adult children are saying that their parents were abusive to them or traumatizing or neglectful. And part of what's confusing for parents is there's a generational divide over what constitutes abusive or neglectful behavior. There's an important study done by an Australian sociologist, Alexander Haslam, and he said that there's been a concept creep of what's considered traumatizing behavior in the past 30 years. 30 years ago, what they would consider traumatic wouldn't even be on the radar for any of us. And it's not that, they're now all softies. A lot of those things are in some ways helpful, but some of those things are unrecognizable to parents. So your adult child may say, you traumatized me in this way, or you abused me in this way, or you neglected me. And from the parent's perspective, they're like, no, you want to know what an abusive childhood was? I had an abusive childhood. Yours was a walk in the park, which won't actually get you anywhere. So it's not a very helpful perspective to take. You want to understand why they feel the way that they do. So empathy, taking responsibility, not being defensive, not trying to explain away, showing resilience. Those are really the most important principles.
Well, when an adult child has cut off communication, how does one proceed? Like in terms of being able to take ownership or
Right.
if they don't even know what it is that's causing.
If you absolutely have no idea, I always recommend that parents write at least one amends letter. And if they don't know, that they should say something like, I know that you wouldn't take this time apart from me unless it was the healthiest thing for you to do. They should start that letter that way, even if they don't understand it, because from the kid's perspective, they wouldn't do it unless they thought it was either the healthiest thing for them to do or the only thing for them to do. From their perspective, it's what they've got to do. So you want to be, in some ways, in a position of alliance with them, not in a position of opposition to them. If you have no idea, you could say, I should know why you feel the need to do this, but I actually don't. It's clear that I have significant blind spots, that I don't have a better understanding of this. would you be comfortable telling me, writing me and telling me more about why you feel that this is the right thing to do? I promise to read it or listen purely as a way of understanding what you're thinking and feeling, and in no way to defend myself. So your main goal is to try to get your child to open the door to you. But you're right, if they're not willing to do that, I still recommend that parents, at least for a few years, particularly if their kid isn't a minor, to continue to reach out to them. In after they've written one amends letter, I recommend 6 weeks to, and I have a whole webinar on writing amends letters because it's actually much more complicated than it seems like it should be.
Mm-hmm.
Then I recommend that they write a brief follow-up to that. But after you've done that, I don't think parents should keep apologizing. I think after that, maybe you write chatty texts or emails once every few weeks, just kind of like just checking in, sending you love, saw this movie with that actor we like. It's a way of saying, I'm here, I love you, I'm willing to connect when you are, I'm not guilt tripping you, that kind of thing. You're mostly just trying to keep the channel open and connected with them while they're doing what they're doing, and that while they are, they feel the need to do it. Now, if you've done that for a few years and you're getting no response, or some kids will threaten their parent with restraining orders, or that they'll threaten their parents with calling the police, or they write to them through their lawyer saying, do not contact me. In that situation, I recommend that parents just drop the ball completely, that you should just let the line go cold for at least a year. And why would that work? Well, sometimes that works for a number of different reasons. One is that your adult child may feel like you're respecting their limits more. Secondly, they may feel like you're respecting yourself more, that you're not continuing to try despite being so rejected.
Mm-hmm.
Third, it creates kind of a new dynamic for the relationship to evolve from. Fourth, it may invite more self-reflection, kind of like, mom's not writing me every few weeks like she's always done. I wonder what's going on. And fifth, related to that, is that it creates an environment where they don't have to feel so defensive. If we continue to reach out to a kid who's estranged, and they don't really want us to do that, every time we reach out, they may feel like they have to justify why they're doing it to themselves. They might feel guilty and then have to justify the guilt by saying, well, I shouldn't feel guilty because, she did that, this or that, or whatever. So if you're not continually pinging them with these kinds of messages, it can allow them to calm down and be more self-reflective as well.
And I appreciate because this whole retreat for me is about us taking responsibility for our own behavior, and recognizing that we have a lot of control of how we view the world.
Right, exactly.
And so, I appreciate that you have that ownership piece, but I also hear there's a boundary to how much ownership we really need to take. It's like there's a limit to it. And I'm curious too, because you mentioned in terms of abuse, like what is normal parent mistakes and what falls into the whole category of, pathological?
Well, I mean, sometimes the view is in the eye of the beholder. So there's plenty of adult children who would never estrange themselves from parents who are truly abusive. And there's plenty of adult children who estrange themselves from parents who are objectively really good parents. So I don't think parents should I think you have to distinguish between what you tell yourself and what you tell your adult child. So I think a parent could reasonably feel, even when they're making amends to an adult child, like I did a reasonable job, or I did a good job given the resources that I had, what the parenting advice was at the time, or who I was married to, or the economic class that I was born into, or the neighborhood that you grow up in, or who your siblings were, or what kind of liabilities you brought to the table. Given all that, I feel like I did a good job. That's what they should tell themselves, but they should tell their child, they should make amends to the child from what the child's experience is. So there's a self-dialogue that you tell yourself to soothe yourself so you don't feel too guilty or ashamed or humiliated. But you tell your child, you make amends to your child for what they feel like they wish had been different. And a related concept there is the principle of separate realities, that when we're raising our children, we could reasonably and objectively feel like we're doing a good job. And our children could reasonably feel like we missed something that they really wish that we had seen. So that's why getting into the right or wrong of it. No, I was a good parent. No, you're not acknowledging all the great things that I did. You
Mhm.
know, no, that wasn't abuse.
Mhm.
It's the fool's errand. It won't ever get you what you want. You're much better off just trying to see it from their perspective and not getting caught up in that debate.
So, in your book, you offer the essential principles for healing. So, would you
Uh-huh.
talk a little bit about those?
I mean, I think the main principles if your kid is estranged from you is to get lots of support, and which is tricky for estranged parents because most of us, if we're going through an estrangement, feel a sense of shame or defectiveness. It's kind of like, you know, you've been proven inadequate at life's most important task. So to feel like your own child has rejected you is a very shameful kind of thing. So to try to find support either through Facebook groups or other kind of online groups, ideally to talk to friends who are psychologically sophisticated enough not to blame you or criticize you or make you feel like this is your fault, which is maybe trickier to find than one might think. So to work on your self-compassion, which is critically important, that might require you being involved in your own therapy to understand how, if you are critical of yourself or judgmental or prone to depression, what are the roots in your own family or your own genetics that might make you vulnerable to that. To do the really basics of self-care in terms of the things that we know are effective, such as meditation, daily exercise, getting enough sleep. You know, those things are talked about all the time in the media because they actually are really important and they really do provide a foundation of a happy life. Those are, I think, are some of the most important in addition to the other ones that I mentioned earlier. I mean, to me, a very big principle in feeling better when you're going through the pain of estrangement is to, and this is related back to back to the importance of having a mindfulness practice, is
Mhm.
related to the DBT concept of radical acceptance, which is we can't white knuckle it through life. If we're going through something profoundly painful and upsetting that we have no control over, we're better off saying it is what it is. You know, particularly if you've done all the steps that I lay out, you're better off just accepting that it is what it is. I have no more control over it. It's in my daughter's or my son's hand, whether or not they reconcile with me. I'm not going to white knuckle it through life. I'm going to pay attention to the good things that I have in my life. I'm going to be grateful for the other people who love me or care about me, or if I'm not estranged from my other children, spending time with them, or if I have a romantic partner, spending time with that person. Those things I think are critically important. And it's easy to buy into your kid's narrative of you as a parent or as a person when they're cutting you off, you know, that you're somehow not a good person, not a good parent, you deserve this, you're supposed to be shamed and rejected. And I think that's bad for parents. And I don't think parents should do that. I think there's a difference between accepting responsibility and taking responsibility and acknowledging your mistakes. And that's very different than saying, yes, I'm a bad person, I'm a bad parent. So I have an exercise in my book where it's called something like what I did right as a parent. It's like write out 10 things about what you did right as a parent and put it on a 3x5 card if you have to make yourself reminded of the ways that you are or were a good parent.
And then, in addition, later on, you talk about, I mean, it comes throughout the book about self-compassion. And I
Right.
know that for so many of us in this generation, that we haven't had compassion for ourselves. We don't know how to have compassion for ourselves. We're hard on
Mhm.
ourselves.
Right.
And so you give some advice around that. And the two things that I recall that stuck out that you said were most important are about getting support and then also focusing on gratitude. And I was hoping you could speak to those two.
Sure. Yeah. So with self-compassion, it's it's I think it's harder than ever in a way because parents are constantly being held up to some model of what they should have been, and that model is constantly changing. And I think the internet has been very destructive to parental well-being because they're constantly being shown some image of what a good parent looks like, or what you should have done or could have done. You know, what you should have been paying attention to. And then if you've got your kid also entering therapy, telling you what you should have done or could have done, it can be very, very hard for you to have compassion for yourself. But it's critically important that you do have compassion for yourself. And one of the ways to make sure that you do is to pay attention to how you talk to yourself. What's your ongoing narrative? Are you harsh? Are you critical? Talk to yourself the way that you would talk to a close friend. If you made mistakes, be forgiving, be kindly, spend time doing things for yourself that are nurturing for yourself. Have dates with yourself where you do things that really make your life feel richer, whether it's spending time in nature or spending time in the things that are meaningful to you, like some kind of an important hobby or a passion. All of those things are critical to having a self-compassionate life.
And then gratitude.
Yeah, gratitude is, it's also harder in a highly capitalistic culture like ours because we're constantly being made to feel like we don't have enough. We should have more. And if we haven't achieved this or bought this or acquired this or had something else, and somehow we're not there. And there isn't really a culture of stopping to smell the roses. So I think everybody every day should spend at least some part of the day thinking, well, what happened that was good today? What do I still have in my life to be grateful for? And it's very easy if you're going through an estrangement for it to really kind of be a blight on your life, for it to block out the sunlight of all these other things in your life that may be going well, for it to feel like it somehow is the ultimate vote on who you are and how you should feel about yourself. A feeling of gratitude can really reorient you to who you are and what your life truly is like and how you should be feeling about yourself. Feeling that way doesn't mean that you aren't compassionate for your child, or you don't repair the mistakes that you made, or you don't, take responsibility. It isn't either or. They're both important to do.
Great. Well, as we wrap up, is there any last thing that you want those watching today to know?
I think really the issue of self-compassion and self-forgiveness in the way that we're talking about is the most important. I think all parents do the best that they can, that even if you made really egregious mistakes with your child or children, you did it for a reason. You did it because it was the best thing that you knew to do in that moment, because of who you were married to, your own childhood, or your own temperamental challenges that you brought into your marriage or the parenting environment, or the challenges of your child, or the challenges of your divorce. All parents really do the best that they can do. So living in a position of self-forgiveness and self-compassion is incredibly important, particularly if you're dealing with a kid's estrangement. To summarize, don't let your kid control the narrative of who you are as a person and as a parent. You have to own that narrative. Nobody deserves to take that away from you, particularly your own child.